Caitlin Clark was left off this roster. And I think we're seeing both sides, right? We're seeing some people really push on like, this is bad for growing the game. This is bad for marketing basketball. This is USA basketball going against their basic, mission statement. This is terrible. And then you have other people being like, oh no, this is good. Actually, the US doesn't need Caitlin Clark. It's ridiculous to think that she would be on this roster. And as you know, everybody knows me on the late sub. I am somewhere in the middle. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of The Late Sub. It is Monday, June 10th. I am your host, Claire Watkins. We have a whole roundabout look at the NWSL this week as they return from the international break. And then we're going to dive into some of the conversation around one of the first major Olympic roster drops of the year. That's right, we are moving into the Olympic period. Very exciting stuff. Let's dig in. All right, so first off this week, we are going to dive back into the world of the NWSL, which returned this week after the international break. Wasted no time. NWSL kind of felt like it was shot out of a cannon this weekend after a weekend off. Things got very wacky very quickly. There were a lot of major milestones, a lot of kind of crazy games. Let's talk through all of the crazy stuff first, and then we'll get into some of the performances. I think the headline for the weekend does have to be that the Chicago Red Stars broke the attendance record at Wrigley Field on Saturday with 35,038 people in attendance. That broke Seattle's previous record set at Megan Rapinoe's final regular season game last year. This was a huge, I was there, lucky to be there. Sometimes it sort of feels like over the last couple of weeks, the women's sports world has bent towards Chicago, which has been very nice for me, who is based there. This was a play for the Red Stars to basically have this proof of concept that people will come see them play if they play inside Chicago city limits. It was the second time in their NWSL history that they had played inside Chicago city limits. They want a stadium. They want to make it accessible for fans. And this was sort of that huge proof of concept of, if we pull this off, if we do this big event at Wrigley Field, 35,000 people will show up. And so it was very, very good to see that attendance number. In Portland's 1-0 win over North Carolina, 2 red cards were given out, 1 to each team, including Sophia Smith's first in her NWSL career. It was a second yellow for time wasting while she was on the bench. I say she's innocent. If you watch the video clip, it looks like maybe she was sort of doing some gamesmanship, moving the ball away during a throw-in. I think the ball scooted on its own. Sophia Smith, innocent, I say, but it was kind of funny to see her get that red card. It would mean that she is suspended for the Cascadia Clash next week. Interesting to see how that plays out. The Kansas City Current scored twice in 89 seconds in the second half of their win against Seattle. In a crazy attacking game, they win 5-2, back and forth stuff. Kansas City continues their unbeaten streak from the beginning of the season. Orlando earned a draw against San Diego, also keeping their unbeaten streak alive, though it did snap their winning streak. It was a ridiculous heel tip goal from Julie Doyle following a ridiculous run from Barbara Banda to open up space. Love that Orlando Pride goal, but kudos to the Wave to come back and tie it 1-1. In terms of major movement, I think people have to be feeling pretty good about Racing Louisville. They're quietly putting some pieces together. 3 games unbeaten to rise in the table, 2 games won in a row. And then Gotham also feel like the big upward momentum here, while Chicago and North Carolina are beginning to feel a little bit like they are in a free fall. So this is the larger landscape of the rising tides and perhaps some of the teams having trouble as we move into the second half of the season. Like I said, some of these game states, some of the circumstances, whether it be the crowd or whether it be some of the officiating or some of the performances, felt again a little bit like the NWSL was benefiting in some ways, but also feeling kind of strange coming off of this international break. Teams get a little bit of time to train. They get a little bit excited to get back out there, and strange things happen. But we also saw sort of the same evaluation of the larger NWSL table that we had during the last time we talked about NWSL before the international break, which is that the table is beginning to separate a little bit. Not to pat myself on the back, but I was talking about how that top 4 was beginning to develop. We've turned that into a top 5 with Gotham. All of those teams got results this weekend. So Kansas City, Orlando, Washington, Portland, and Gotham all earned results. Not all wins, but all results, opening a 5-point gap between that top 5 and the rest of the field. Now, 5 points doesn't feel like too much, but in the context of perhaps what people remember about last year, this is significant. There are teams that are making a push early to get above that quote unquote playoff line very, very early in the season. Gotham in particular is continuing to impress me. I really, really like what we've seen from Gotham. As everybody knows, they're a team that's been dealing with availability issues throughout the season. They need a little bit of time to gel with new faces on the team, but I could see them continuing to climb the table in the second half of this season. They've been relying on their defense a lot through some close contests. And I don't just mean their back line when I say that they've been relying on their defense. The whole team plays defense from the attack to the midfield to the defense, and it radically shapes both the tempo and the direction of a game. They won this week against Angel City. Angel City themselves still look like they're kind of desperate for an attacking identity. They put some pieces together to get a goal back, but it was a well-earned win by Gotham against Angel City. But what I think is opening those things up for Gotham, because we knew going into the season, we know how head coach Juan Carlos Amaros likes his teams to play, right? He likes a full team press. He likes to generate turnovers in the box. He likes to make sure the team is steady in defensive transition so that they're not giving up cheap goals. We have seen the team do all of that pretty much from the beginning of the season. But what is opening up for Gotham, and this is kind of the premise, I think, of the whole segment today on NWSL, if we are talking about trends from the last 3 or so weeks, is that their attack is beginning to click. And this is where Gotham is not only going to be able to compete in every game that they play, but they're going to be able to control every game that they play. Ella Stevens didn't get on the score sheet this week, but her impact was felt. She wears defenses down. She was constantly creating things in front of Angel City's goal. And it also allows that sort of wearing down of another team's defense, allows a team like Gotham to make impact subs later in the game. The Bats also get 2 goals from 2 U.S. Women's National Team megastars. They get one from Crystal Dunn, and they get one from Rose Lavelle. Now, these are 2 players that, if you were listening to the show last week, you kind of had a sense they genuinely need to keep building into this year. I don't think they are in danger of not being included on an Olympic roster, but they are players where the question is, where do they start? Where do they play? Are they coming off of the bench? Are they here as veterans, or are they here as day one starting level contributors? Growing into the year, especially for someone like Dunn playing on the wings, which is where she's recently been playing for the United States, or Lavelle showcasing what she can do in the middle of the pitch. She very distinctly hit a goal off of her left foot as an inverted coming in from the right, was able to transfer the ball over to her left foot. Really good tape on why Rose Lavelle perhaps is not best suited, as we all know, to like being stuck out on the left wing. Really good tape from those 2 that directly translate to their U.S. Women's National Team ambitions, which is good for club and for country. And it also just means, again, that the team is set up to succeed. They've hit their fundamentals, but it's because the attack is opening up and they are getting those contributions from those U.S. Women's National Team players that were not as available at the beginning of the season. And perhaps, I hate to say it, might be less available once they come back from the Olympics, depending on fitness and form. You need them at this part of the season. You need to be making this climb up to the top of the table. I also briefly want to shout out Sinead Farrelly, who retired effective immediately this week due to cumulative head injuries. She was given medical advice that due to the head injuries that she's suffered during her career, some of the concussions she has suffered during the career, it is in her best interest to retire from professional soccer. People might know Sinead Farrelly. She changed the NWSL permanently for the better by coming forward about her alleged abuse at the hands of head coach Paul Riley in 2021. She is someone who will be one of the legends of the league for the rest of the league's existence. And to her credit, she will also be a huge loss on the field. She's a very, very good holding midfielder. Her technical ability on the ball, Gotham will miss very much. So I just also wanted to shout out Sinead Farrelly. But back to my big premise for today, looking bigger than Gotham, because I actually think Gotham is relatively unique in the way that they've been building into this season, which is that they were relying a lot on those basic full team principles. And now the attack is following up and opening up. We're actually seeing very attacking football be rewarded this year in the NWSL in a way that actually feels kind of refreshing. I think I've said before about how once you move sort of into the dog days of summer, defense becomes the name of the game. Goals start to dry up. We see players start on these goal streaks early in the season and they sort of lose their touch halfway through the season. Weather and travel can impact that. International duties can impact that. But we are still seeing teams be rewarded for very brave attacking football. And I think that has made the NWSL a really fun season, or a very fun league to watch this year. You can call it an expansion year. You're going to see more wide open play, probably in an expansion year. You're going to see more separation from the top of the table to the bottom of the table. But it's not just teams grinding out results. You look at the 2 Shield leaders, right? Orlando and Kansas City. These are 2 very attacking teams, which is in and of itself a difference from perhaps San Diego, who won the Shield last year, or OL Reign, who won the Shield 2 years ago. The principles and the aspects of how these how these teams like to play is fundamentally different than what we usually see in the context of a team that is in the top of the Shield race. I really liked a stat that Opta had today, talking about attacking sequences. And the teams with the best individual performers in shot involvements per 90 tended to be those teams in the top 4. Orlando has 3 players in that top group. Washington has 2. Portland has 2. Kansas City has 2. Those top 4 teams have a number of players who are not only playing well as a team in the attack, but they are also individually generating a large number of scoring chances, a lot of number of goal involvements. Now, you might be like, duh, right? Scoring goals wins games. Can't win games without scoring goals. But I think maybe a good example of how, again, this sort of attacking style is being rewarded this year is the one other player on that list is Dana Castellanos of Bay FC. Now, that's a good example of how being overly focused on the attack can cause problems for a club. Now, the Bay got a win this week. They got actually that huge 2-1 win over Chicago in Wrigley Field with 35,000 people in attendance. But after that game, head coach Alberto Montoya literally said that the way Bay set themselves up this season was to focus on the attack first and only during the season start implementing defensive principles into how they want to play. They really wanted a shutout in that game, and they didn't quite get it. They were very disappointed not to get a shutout. They focused on a world-class attack. They made the decision that they were going to develop the defense second. Now, the Bay has looked better in recent weeks, no doubt. But they are sitting in 10th for this very reason. People have seen them take early leads that they aren't able to hold. They have seen them concede and not be able to come back. A world-class attack can't always overcome a leaky defense. And while perhaps you say Orlando has made good adjustments to their defense, we've seen some really nice individual performances there, they're thriving on their cohesive attack. They possess well in the attacking third. They live in the opponent's penalty area. They move the ball in the opponent's half. That smart ball possession and progression is putting other teams on their heels. Kansas City, like I said, won 5-2 this week. They concede twice. They actually go down by conceding twice in the first half of this game. They stumble in the back a little bit. They are still regrouping, actually, after losing Gabby Robinson for the rest of the season, but their attacking fire is ridiculous. They always come back. If you go to their social media accounts, every time they conceded, their Twitter account was like, but just wait, don't worry, we're coming back, doesn't matter. And that happened to be true. And I actually think that's a decent thesis for how Kansas City has been playing. It's kind of funny to see that under a Vlatko Andonovski team, but they're not worried about conceding because they know that they can always come back. Portland, for example, their slow start stemmed from defensive mistakes and sort of aimless possession and a lack of spacing in the midfield. But this was despite really strong underlying attacking stats. They commit basically to a much stronger full team press to ward off that defensive danger. They do actually still have question marks in their defense, but they've got the whole team involved now in full team defending that have warded some of that off. They've let Sophia Smith cook, and they're back near the top again. That's the big turnaround from them from the beginning of the season to now, was to trust the attacking stats, the underlying attacking stats, that they were going to win out and goals were going to be scored. And then they have made slight tweaks to offset the danger and perhaps their lack of pace and sometimes positioning in the defense. And then also some of the middle to lower table teams are showing what happens when your attack becomes stagnant, right? Chicago, again, pulls off a fantastic event on Saturday. I thought it was wonderful. Had a great time. But their defense is under constant pressure due to a lack of connectivity in the midfield and an inability to find Mallory Swanson in the attack. Chicago looked very timid in this game, and they've looked increasingly timid as the season has gone on. It's not because they don't have quality 1v1 defending in the back. It's because they cannot possess and cannot progress the ball. And when they do get the ball in defensive transition, they are not finding Swanson. They have some very basic things they need to work on there. North Carolina, for example, I've said this over and over again. They are like the platonic idea of a soccer club outside of the fact that they really struggle to score. It's derailing their best laid plans. You can put this perfect soccer team together. They know how they want to defend. They know how they want to progress the ball. They have a lot of technical talent that they are utilizing, but they just cannot put the ball in the back of the net. And then San Diego, last year's Shield winners, maybe the final example of this, perhaps a little bit too reliant on sort of their overworked playmaking stars and quick distribution from the defense. They're getting these gritty results from the bench. Like I said, they earned a draw this week, but plan A isn't working as well this year because it was perhaps too thin last year to hold up. And it simply does not matter how world-class your defense is. If you cannot score, you're going to struggle to get results. Or maybe even you go all the way down the table to Seattle. Seattle's, their struggles continued, but they got this huge boost from Jordan Heidema this week. She scores a brace. They go up 1-0. They go up 2-1. but it just cannot match the defensive disorganization that they suffered at the hands of Kansas City. So I love it. I think it makes for really exciting football. I think it rewards tactical bravery. I think, again, it sort of wards off those dog days of summer doldrums that you fall into when you do start to move into international absences or really, really hot games weather-wise or crowded fixtures. I do think perhaps, unfortunately, we are still going to see that this season. I'm hot and cold on the Summer Cup, the cup that the NWSL is having with Liga MX femenil teams during the Olympics. I think programming wise, it's fantastic. I really, really like it, but I am also a little bit concerned that with that and the Champions Cup, where you are going to see NWSL teams playing these Liga MX femenil teams anyway, it starts to feel like a lot of heavy programming when you want teams to still be playing at their best at the end of the season. And then also, I think people who have been following NWSL for a long time also know you just never know what state you are getting players back after an Olympics. I think maybe the best example was Sam Kerr in 2019 after the 2019 World Cup. She comes back after a disappointing tournament for Australia and crushes. She comes back for Chicago. She earns the Golden Boot. She sets the single season scoring record. She leads Chicago to their first NWSL final. That is the best case scenario. Maybe it's driving a player, or they have sort of an international disappointment that they come back and they play with a new fire beneath them. But what happens sometimes as well is maybe a team actually does quite well in a tournament like the Olympics or a tournament like the World Cup, and they come back and they're a little bit beat up, right? They've been handling knocks, they've been gutting through stuff in order to win gold. Fully understandable, but it does impact the way teams play at the end of the season. And then when you do over program while those players are away, that means that your depth is also dealing with fitness and perhaps form issues. So I am cautiously optimistic about what we'll see for these teams as the summer continues. But my plea is perhaps for coaches to be very willing to rotate and to remain brave tactically, because this has made for some really exciting performances in NWSL this season and made it a very fun season to watch so far. And speaking of the Olympics, we are going to talk about the Olympic roster that has everyone all aflutter this week, but probably not the one you're thinking of. We focus a lot on soccer international rosters sometimes on this show, or just in general. I think that perhaps soccer fans are a little bit more fluent in the emotional roller coaster of following your favorite players and seeing whether or not they are going to make a major tournament roster. But today we are going to actually be talking about basketball. The Athletic broke the news overnight on Saturday that the USA women's basketball team has been decided. It has not been officially announced. We're recording this on Monday. I think we are anticipating getting that full roster officially announced on Tuesday. So if any of this information is incorrect, obviously we can check on that. But no one is really acting like this is not the case. I mean, we've actually had players already asked about it and answer questions about it. It's usually just being kind of considered that this is the list. This is the correct list. So I'm going to say what the Athletic reported, and we're going to talk about this list as fact. The roster is 12 players. There are no alternates for a USA basketball roster, though there is a short list, and we'll get to that a little bit later, for who might step in the face of injury. But unlike soccer, there are no alternates that actually travel with the team. But the 12-player roster for USA basketball this year is Asia Wilson, Brianna Stewart, Diana Taurasi, Alyssa Thomas, Brittany Griner, Nafisa Collier, Jewel Lloyd, Kelsey Plum, Jackie Young, Kalia Copper, Sabrina Ionescu, and Chelsea Gray. So let's talk about some of the overall stats here before we dive into our surprises and snubs, because that has been what people have been wanting to talk about the most. So there's a huge emphasis on veteran leadership here. There are only 3 new Olympians in this group with no 5v5 or 3v3 experience. Those 3 players are Kalia Copper, Alyssa Thomas, and Sabrina Ionescu. There are even a few players who did play for the team in Tokyo who were not asked back. Those players are Skylar Diggins-Smith, Ariel Atkins, Tina Charles, and obviously the retired Sylvia Fowles. We saw Kelsey Plum and Jackie Young rewarded for a couple obviously truly excellent years in the WNBA, but also winning gold 3v3 in Tokyo. Ryan Howard, who was, I believe, initially in contention for 5v5, is being rewarded kind of for that ongoing development in 3v3. She did qualify for the 3v3 team alongside, people remember, former college star Cam Brink and current college star Haley Van Lith. So for surprises, let's talk positives first before we get into snubs. I think Kahleah Copper is probably the biggest inclusion surprise for me, not because of fit or because of talent, but just because, again, when you talk about sort of the politics of how a team is decided or some of those experience considerations and fit considerations, you never know exactly how a player is going to stick in the committee's particular decision making. Very happy to see Copper included. She's been in camps with the team for years. She has competed in other major tournaments other than the Olympics. She is already a WNBA Finals MVP. And not for nothing, has just had a very good start to this season. It's her first season in Phoenix, and she's playing really well. I think people maybe don't think that this roster, I don't think they're necessarily wrong to sometimes think that this, again, not unlike soccer sometimes, is based on experience and what they know you can do. But Copper's playing incredibly well right now. And I think she also has this built-in knowledge at this point, not because she is playing in Phoenix with Diana Taurasi and Brittany Griner. Now, moving to Griner, the two other perhaps surprises, light surprises maybe, just considering their injury status, are Griner and Chelsea Gray. So Gray has not played yet this WNBA season, and Griner has only just returned to the court following a foot fracture. But if you think about team need and, again, developing players at particular positions, Griner is still one of the most dominant centers in women's basketball, and she has a physical profile that no other player can match. And Chelsea Gray is a true point guard. She runs the floor for both the Aces and has experience doing that for the U.S. She's not like a wing or a shooting guard. She takes care of the ball and she facilitates. And the U.S., again, not taking Skylar Diggins-Smith only makes her more valuable to the team if she can play. And again, talking about camps, talking about experience, it was interesting. I was pulling photos from Getty for a newsletter segment on this. If you're not subscribed to the Just Women's Sports newsletter, please do so. And I think people are maybe forgetting that Gray did participate in USA Basketball's training camp in April. I'm sure it was non-contact. Like I said, she hasn't played in the WNBA yet. I don't know if maybe there was a setback after that or what that means for her actual injury status, but she has been in with the team and she's been working on how the team wants to play and getting to know Cheryl Reeves' staff and the style that they want to play and working on schemes and bringing the ball up and directing traffic and running the floor. And so Gray, it's not like Gray has just sort of been sitting at home waiting for a call. She was in camp, as was Griner before that foot fracture. So if you're looking at who was with the team, literally the U.S. team most recently, Gray and Griner are in that group. This is not sort of random for them. Again, you're going to need them to be fit. And like I said, there is a short list for injury replacement. But for someone like Gray and for someone like Griner, it does not make any sense to leave them off the roster right now. If they can't go, they can't go, and adjustments will be made. But there is absolutely no reason to shut the door on them at this moment. But now let's get to snubs, because the big conversation that people are having is Caitlin Clark was left off this roster. And I think we're seeing both sides, right? We're seeing some people really push on like, this is bad for growing the game. This is bad for marketing basketball. This is USA Basketball going against their basic, mission statement. This is terrible. And then you have other people being like, oh no, this is good. Actually, the US doesn't need Caitlin Clark. It's ridiculous to think that she would be on this roster. And as you know, everybody knows me on the late sub. I am somewhere in the middle. I do think the conversation is relevant on the court. I actually think in some ways it's relevant off the court, but let's think about it from a roster health standpoint before getting into the idea of marketing, because I think, again, I'm coming from this from a soccer lens, right? Where US Women's National Team stars are built through time on the team. You get to know players on the US Women's National Team. And again, that's where if you are worried about marketing, which I do think is a factor, but not the most important one, you get to know these players through their time with the US. It's not exactly the same for basketball because they spend less time together, and also the mechanism for stardom is still the WNBA. So I do think that the idea that Caitlin Clark needs to be on the USA Basketball roster for some sort of next level of notoriety is kind of silly. That's just not how the player pool works. But I do think maybe the more relevant question is the US roster committee for USA Basketball doing the right thing in terms of player pool development? There's been discontent in previous years about what it means to kind of let the old guard stay on this team and what it takes to let young players break through. This is not a conversation that begins or ends with Caitlin Clark. It's one that comes up every single Olympic year. Is the committee making the right choice to build development for the future? Is it letting young stars rise? Or is it too beholden on aging stars that they know and trust? Diana Taurasi, famously going for her 6th Olympic gold medal. She's playing perfectly well this season, but as everybody knows, it is kind of a tale as old as time. It is so easy to fall too far on the side of relying on aging stars who, again, you trust because you've seen them do things before. You're remembering what they've done for the team in the past, and you can push experience. But again, from a soccer lens, people know what the downfall of that can be. Sometimes it means you're carrying a player on the roster that cannot contribute in the same ways that they could in the past. People have noted the alienation of Candace Parker and Nneka Ogwumike as sort of like counter arguments to Clark's exclusion, but I actually think they're relevant in the opposite direction. They do need to make sure that communication has been clear with Clark, let her know that she is part of the team's future, get her into camps immediately after the Olympics, and go from there. There is a relevant player pool health conversation to have about not letting a player like Clark, who I am sure is in the team's future, gain valuable experience. The U.S. has not won an Olympic gold medal since 1996. The strength of the U.S. in the sport, or the strength of the sport in the United States, has meant that a lot of individual player development happens in the WNBA. It is not something that is relied upon to be into camp after camp after camp with the United States. But I think it's fair to be disappointed on behalf of a young star who could probably benefit from this experience, but even just still based on the internal criteria of the committee. If the committee prizes experience, you must get experience to be valued by the committee. This is, again, a tale as old as time for international inclusion into a major tournament roster. I think we've also seen the argument. Again, I'm not making kind of a marketing argument, but we have seen that argument of like, she'll just ride the bench. Why does it matter? Because she's getting that experience. The player that is now kind of getting that experience in a different way is like, for example, Sabrina Ionescu. How much is Sabrina Ionescu going to play? We're not sure. This is going to be her first Olympic experience. That player has been in the league for 4 years now. Is this happening fast enough? Is it healthy enough? However, as defensible as I do think it is to push for a player like Clark to be on this roster, I also think it's a defensible decision to leave her off. And as we know, leading into a major tournament, the little things really matter. Really, really matter. What camp were you in? How did you play in these particular games? How do you play with other teammates on the team? How do you overcome different defensive schemes to make it seem like you'll be ready for a really quick, brutal tournament? Here are all the little things that just kind of went wrong for Clark. She missed that USA training camp before the Final Four because she was playing in the Final Four. That was absolutely the right decision for her, and one I'm actually sure that USA Basketball supported her on. But I don't know, maybe she does get one camp and things feel differently. She gets into the one camp with Cheryl Reeve, and she gets in with these players, and maybe things do feel differently to the committee, right? She's had a good but not great start to the season, and I think that lies on the Indiana Fever. She is not the only player on the Fever who kind of got a snub from the International Committee. Aaliyah Boston also did not make the team. The Fever's dysfunction, whether it's on or off, I'm not accusing them of anything we just haven't seen other than just not really knowing what principles they want to follow on the court. That does affect a player's standing when it comes to an international team. Like I said, you saw teammates for Vegas make this team. You saw teammates for Phoenix make this team. The fact that Indiana has struggled, I'm not blaming Clark for this, but it does mean that she has been sort of a good production number player on high volume shooting, on not amazing percentages, and she's been learning how to limit her turnovers. An Olympic tournament is not a time to kind of work those kinks out, right? Especially if the idea is that Clark would be bringing the ball up the floor. If you are saying, sort of that Chelsea Gray idea or one of those other guards, it's not an issue of talent, but it's purely an issue of timing. She hasn't figured out how to limit the turnovers on her own, which I'm not saying she should. Like I said, I think a lot of this lies at the feet of the Fever, but she's just not there yet. And when you do move into knockout play on an Olympic tournament, as people know, it's brutal. You don't get second chances. And without having other teammates on the roster to gel, again, missing camps, it's just a little bit of a whirlwind of things that limit Clark's ability to kind of overcome those difficult odds. And then maybe the other easiest one, if we're going to Occam's razor this, there's just a lot of other really good, played in, experienced, and not that old shooting guards on this roster, right? A bigger snub in terms of on-the-court production is Arike Ogunbowale in Dallas. She could bring, she brings more league experience. She has better individual numbers, but for whatever reason, there's something about her production or the way she plays with her teammates or the fact that there aren't other Dallas players on the team or all these other little individual factors that keep Ogunbowale on the outside looking in. Jackie Young and Kelsey Plum or other two shooting guards. They are on this team. Played really well on back-to-back championship teams. They're already played in with Wilson and Gray, and they played on the 3v3 team 4 years ago. Again, timing and patience for these two players as well. And again, if you just need sort of a high volume 3-point shooter off the bench, I think right now, if you have to win an Olympic gold medal, you're taking Ionescu. I don't think Ionescu is probably going to get a ton of time in these games, but she's going to come out and do a very particular thing based on the league experience that she has and the chemistry that she's built playing on the Liberty with a player like Stewart, right? So again, I think both decisions are defensible. I think there's a really good argument for including Clark. I think there's a really good argument for leaving her off. Now, The Athletic did also report that this shortlist for injury replacement does include Clark. The 3 players on that shortlist, as reported by The Athletic, were Caitlin Clark, Brianna Jones, and Aaliyah Boston. Should something go wrong between now and Paris, or like I said, if you have players who are a little bit early in their injury recovery, making sure if those timelines don't follow the way they would like them to, there are players waiting in the wings. I still think the USA roster balance is a little wonky. I still do kind of question taking a player like Taurasi, though maybe one note for that is that if you do have players who maybe their only Olympic experience was in Tokyo, that was not a normal Olympic experience, you probably do want players with experience that go back to at least 2016 to walk you through a more normal schedule or normal interactions at an Olympics. I do have questions. I have questions about even bringing a player like Skylar Divigan-Smith off. She's coming back from pregnancy. Again, timing. But if Gray is your only true point guard, that's kind of scary for the U.S. Or if you're not entirely sure how to rotate your bigs to make that work, that's kind of scary for the U.S. They had a really close call against Belgium earlier this year. So I'm expecting competition to be fierce, and I'm expecting actually the U.S. to have some really interesting games that have nothing to do with whether or not they left a rookie on or off the roster. And so I'm excited again. I kind of always finish these segments with there's so much more to see. There's so much more to figure out about how this team is going to play. And there are a lot of really good players on this team that may or may not play well together. And like I said, from a soccer lens, when you cover the U.S., you want to be excited about them playing well and them growing the game and them pushing the sport forward. But also there are still really interesting things to follow in not doing that, in making mistakes with your roster selection, or maybe not having the tactics necessary to win a tournament. And that's sports. And what I really want is for the U.S. basketball team to get to this point the same way I want the Dub to be there. I want the NWSL to be there. I feel like we're getting closer and closer for the U.S. women's national team to be there, of just talking about the intricacies of what works and what doesn't in the context of a sports conversation, rather than a lot of the other factors that I actually just think Caitlin Clark's going to continue to crush it. She could really use the Olympic break. Stardom is made in the WNBA anyway. That is how the USA basketball team works, and that's not going to go anywhere. And also, not for nothing, I think Clark is a surefire all-star. If not, I would certainly think it would be a coach's decisions, but also it's a fan vote. And obviously we know she's a very, very popular player. She might get to play against USA Basketball's roster before they go to the Olympics. That's good TV. That's Stardom. That's growing the game. That's talking about the sport of basketball in an interesting way, I think. So I do find all of the conversation around this sometimes frustrating, but I think it is hopefully an entry point to dig deeper. And then hitting a couple big sports notes that happened this week outside of our two main segments are going to touch a little bit on WNBA. Connecticut suffered their first loss of the season this weekend, meaning that no WNBA teams are left undefeated. On the other end, the poor Mystics are still looking for their first win. They are 0-12, despite looking good in spurts. Like I said, it's really hard to be bad this year. The Aces are really beaten up. They've been suffering losses recently, but they've been having some major absences. They might need some roster help with player dealing with injuries and illness. We know that Chicago is about to see a lot more from star rookies Camila Cardoso and Angel Reese after a meniscus tear suffered by Elizabeth Williams. And also, the Liberty look great. The Liberty look really good. I'm always my short thoughts about the Liberty last week were that they're better than the Fever. And then my short thoughts about them this week is that they're better than a lot of players or a lot of teams. So Liberty look good. Moving over to the world of tennis, Iga Swiatek wins the French Open yet again. After surviving a second round scare against Naomi Osaka, she goes on a tear. She never looks back. It's her fourth French Open title in 5 years. It is her third straight. She has never lost a Grand Slam final. Ridiculous run. New singles world number two, I should say, Coco Gauff earned her first Grand Slam doubles title at the same tournament. Really exciting. Two young, talented players, number one and number two in Swiatek and Gauff. And then in softball, let's keep the streaks going. Oklahoma won their 4th straight softball title, this time over Texas. The Sooners have had their stumbles this year in the regular season and a couple close calls in the postseason as well, but the finals were not close. Just a ridiculous stretch by a ridiculous team. Congratulations to the Oklahoma Sooners on making softball history. So this has been this week's edition of The Late Sub. We'll have more good basketball and soccer for you next week. I have been your host, Claire Watkins. Shout out to producer extraordinaire Parker Fenton. Stick with us. We may have more for you later this week. And if not, check us out on all audio channels next